Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 30th of October of 2024. Today we have a lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And of course, the most important updates these days are coming from the South Donetsk direction, where the Russians continue their offensive, their Kurakhove offensive operation. The Russians concentrated everything they have exactly in this direction. The Ukrainians are trying to regroup and to bring additional forces with the purpose to stabilize, but we see that Ukrainians haven't managed to complete the stabilization, and more military experts are saying that most likely the Ukrainians would be forced to fall back from this territory. And the most important, that currently nobody knows for sure where exactly the Ukrainians are going and are planning to stop the Russians, because once again there is one big problem. There is a very big gap between the WWII direction. We're talking, let's say, about the settlement of Mikhailovka, and let's say the settlement of Pokrovsk. We're talking about this line, and as you can see, this line is almost completely empty without any fortifications in the strongholds. And if the Russians are able to get this line, then most likely nothing will be able to stop the Russians until the river of Dnipro. And this is going to be completely different special military operation, completely different terms in if ever negotiation starts between Russia and Ukraine. Now let's talk and let's start about details, and let's start from the beginning. And first we're going to talk about the settlements of Shakhtarska and Yasna Polyana. According to different mappers, the village of Yasnaya Polyana was captured by the Russians today. Was captured and secured completely. We have just one video from the territory, but without any presence of Russian soldiers. It's just a video with a Russian drone, and the author of this video says that this is the empty video, not the empty, this is the video, this is the village that was captured by the Russians, and so on. Anyway, we don't have any geolocations that confirm the Russian presence on the northern part, but we believe that this is exactly like this, because the second day in a row we are continuing receiving updates about further and additional Russian advance in the northern directions towards the settlement of Constantinople and the settlement of Rozlev. And we discussed this situation in this area. Let's discuss this once again. This is very important map. This is very important picture, because this picture shows with very good quality the complex network of the fortifications of the armored forces of Ukraine in the South Donetsk direction. And the problem is that there is a very huge gap between the Ukrainian defense lines of Zaporozhye direction and the Ukrainian defense fortifications of the Kurakhove direction. We are talking about this territory. Basically, there are no fortifications, no minefields, no strongholds, nothing in this square. The Russians, of course, understand this. The Russians know this, and the Russians are going to attack exactly in this direction. And maybe the Russians have already launched an offensive. We haven't received anything that can confirm this, but sometimes something very important needs to be in secret. But we have lots of geolocations from this sector. For example, the Russians during the previous 24 hours were bombing this territory heavily with the use of the multiple launch rocket systems. In this video we can see the Russian drone that was flying above the settlements, and when the Russians managed to discover the concentration of Ukrainian forces, the Russians began bombing this territory. A little bit further in the southern direction we have several FABs arrived on the territory of the village of Rozlev. So this concentration of Russian attacks, artillery attacks, confirms that most likely this is the direction the Russians are planning to move. Of course, we understand that the Ukrainians understand the situation as well. Of course, the Ukrainians are not stupid. They know where the Russians are planning to go, but the problem is whether the Ukrainians have enough of forces, reinforcements, and reserves to stabilize the area. In fields, the Ukrainians are going to protect this territory in fields, not in trenches, not in the fortifications, not in the strongholds. They will be forced to fight with the Russians in fields, and I have some doubts whether the Ukrainians are able to do this. Now let's talk about the settlement of Novoukrainka. Today we have just one video from the territory of this village, and this video was published by the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainian author reported that right exactly in this video we can see the process of how the Ukrainians were bombing the edge Russian positions. During the video we will not be able to see even a single Russian soldier, but so we have adjusted the map in Russian favor, at least the south and in the southwestern part of the settlement. But as for different mappers like neutral mappers and pro-Ukrainian source, which is very important, the Russians managed to secure the village completely. Maybe tomorrow the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation will confirm this information. As for now, the Russians from the settlement of Novoukrainka are planning to move further in the eastern direction with the purpose to attack this stronghold, and the Russians from this territory are going to move further in the northern direction with the purpose to attack Maximovka. As for this stronghold, the Russians are moving in the direction of this territory from the west, and of course the Russians are moving in this direction from the east. At least the Russian progress from the east was confirmed by different mappers. According to them, this territory, these three lines of forest, these brushes were taken by the Russians. Furthermore, the Russians improved their positions in the northern direction and established complete control over the fortifications right to the south from the settlement of Trudove. There are very heavy clashes right now. The Ukrainians are trying to stabilize the situation. As for the village of Trudove, the positions of the armored forces of Ukraine is perfect for defense, but so we have some doubts whether the Ukrainians are able to show any resistance to the Russians. So we see that the Russians during the previous 4 or 5 days shown us the significant progress exactly in this direction. And once again, let's take a look on the process, on the things of how the things were developing since the 25th of October. Once again, this is the situation just 5 days ago. The Russians were on another bank of the river by the name of Kashligach. This is the river. The Russian main positions were along this river, and on the 25th of October, on the 26th, on the morning of the 26th of October, we got the first reports and first videos of the Russian breakthrough in the northern direction. We have a lot of reports, lots of posts that the Russians improved their positions in the south of Bogayavlenka, in the south of Shakhtarska. Then we got another day, another significant progress on the second day of clashes on the south Donetsk direction. The Russians established control over 60% of Bogayavlenka just on the second day. And obviously sometimes it's very difficult even to believe in these numbers and this speed of the Russian forces. On the third day, the Russians managed to establish complete control, almost complete control over 80-90% of Bogayavlenka. The Russians captured around 50% of Shakhtarska, and we start receiving first videos from the village of Yasnaya Polyana. On the fourth day, the Bogayavlenka fell. The village of Yasnaya Polyana about to fall. Most of the villages were defense of the most of the settlements were almost collapsed, and the situation was just worsening. And today, on the 30th of October, everything in the South Donetsk direction, almost everything was captured by the Russians. This is the significant progress, and as for this direction, I would like to remind you that this is the area of responsibilities of the group of forces East. So we just finished with the first Russian army that is involved in a common operation by the name of Kurakhove offensive operation. Now we are moving to the area of responsibilities of the group of forces South. This is the area between the settlements of Katerinovka and the settlement and the city of Kurakhove. And this is very complicated, very difficult direction. And as for this territory between Katerinovka itself and Elizavetovka, from this area we haven't received anything at all. Most likely the situation is very complicated. Either the situation is very complicated or the Russians are regrouping after the fall of Katerinovka, because just yesterday the Russians reported that the settlement was captured. Obviously the Russians need additional several days to regroup, to restore their forces, and then to continue moving further in the direction of Elizavetovka, Ilinka and Romanovka. As for Kurakhove, we got lots of updates from this territory. We have already discussed the Russian offensive operation. We have already discussed the operation of how the Russians were trying to clear the passage, to clear the road before further advance of the Russian tank convoys, how there was very heavy clashes, very close combat between Ukrainians and the Russian forces, but in the end the Russians managed to take under control the defense belt, to introduce additional forces, and to enter the eastern part of the settlement of Kurakhove. We have even geolocations that confirm the presence of the armored force of Russian Federation exactly in this point, which is obviously the significant progress of the Russians. So these are the changes on the ground just during the previous few days. First, the Russians were moving slowly, step by step, in the direction of Kurakhove. This is on the 27th, this is on the 29th of October, and this is the situation by the end of the 30th of October. Furthermore, some reliable pro-Russian resources reported that as a result of clashes, the entire eastern part of Kurakhove was captured by the Russians. So summarizing everything, there are very high chances that this territory is already under complete Russian control. We still haven't received any video that can confirm this, but the situation may look like this. Furthermore, the Russians during the previous 24 hours were bombing the settlement of Dalnya. I supposed and I expected that the Russians would try to outflank the city of Kurakhove from the south exactly through the territory of this settlement, but now the Russians are bombing the settlement just to slow down the Ukrainians, to pin them down, and not to allow the Ukrainians to counterattack the Russians in their southern flank. So this is the situation here, and we have finished with the group of forces south, which is responsible for offensive operation on the line between Yelizavetovka and the city of Kurakhove. This is the second army that is involved in this entire biggest Kurakhove offensive operation, and obviously this is something unique experience for the Russians. Now let's talk about the area of responsibilities of group of forces center, and this group is responsible for the line between Kurakhovka and further in the north western directions towards the settlement of Novoukrainka. There are very heavy clashes, so the Russians managed to improve their position significantly, and the Russians managed to finish the complete encirclement of the Ukrainians that are currently located on the territory of the rest, Kurakhove and the settlement of Vovchenka. Today, the Russian sources published a video of how the clashes and offensive operation in this area was taking place. This area is under responsibilities of the 114th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade of the Armed Forces of Russian Federation. There are lots of episodes. If you have access to map, you will be able to watch the entire video, to go through the entire video. During this video, we might see the significant number of Ukrainians that were surrendered, that were captured by the Russians. We can see the significant number of episodes of how the Russians were raising the flags, and the Russians raised the flags in very important and strategical points. We're talking about this industrial zone. One of the flags was geolocated exactly in this point. Another flag was geolocated exactly in the central part of Kurakhove, and the third flag was geolocated to the north on the mine of the land of the mine number 42. This is the significant progress, and I have no doubts that by the end of the 30th of October, and probably by the time you're going to watch this video, the Russians most likely would take under control the rest of Kurakhove, and those Ukrainians who are able to escape would escape by the evening of the 30th of October, or by the let's say morning of the 31st of October. The territory, this artillery pocket, this salient would be destroyed and eliminated by the Russians during the next 24 hours, and this is obviously. Now let's move further. So these are the entire Russian offensive operation, where the Russians are using 3 armies in this attack. I'll remind you that as for Ukrainians, as for their level of let's say operation, or let's say of operating with the forces, the Ukrainians stacked on the level of brigade level. So the Ukrainians, when talking about their attack, their offensive, they managed to learn how to use and operate just with brigades, separate brigades. For example, they're taking one brigade and they're attacking in this direction. They're taking another brigade and they're attacking in another direction. The Ukrainians, since the beginning of the special military operation, haven't shown us their possibilities and their experience and how they can attack and make additional or different operations with the use of armies of different responsibilities and different command centers. And this is exactly what the Russians are showing us right now. Kurakhove itself, from strategical point, is very important, but from the perspective of experience, obviously the Russians are gaining much. They're gaining a lot, and then they will use this experience on other directions, like Kupyansk direction, like Chasiv Yar direction, like probably even Slaviansk-Kramatorsk directions, and so on. Now let's move further. Today we have additional changes on the ground in the Pokrovsk direction. The Russians made an attempt to attack the Ukrainian positions along the road between Grodovka and Mirnograd. The Russians were using just one storm squad, but something went wrong and the Russians were ambushed by the Ukrainian FPV drones. But anyway, most of the mappers have adjusted this territory in Russian favor based on this video. Now let's move further. As for the city of Chasiv Yar and the city of Donetsk, during the previous 24 hours we haven't received anything special, just regular videos of clashes on the main road N32 between the village of Ivanovska and Konstantinovka itself. And currently this road, this last and the main supply road of Chasiv Yar, is the main battlefield between the Russian sabotage and reconnaissance group and Ukrainian forces. We got a lot of videos exactly from this area of how the Russians were attacking, ambushing the Ukrainian forces forces exactly here. Currently, the Ukrainians can't feel free themselves in this area. The Russian sabotage and reconnaissance group operates here, and something tells me that there is a lot of gray zones exactly in this area. Now let's talk about the Siversk direction. The main updates are coming from this territory, from the Kryminaya forest. The Russians are saying that they're about to finish the encirclement of the armed forces of Ukraine, of their units that are located currently in this part of Kryminaya forest. The Russians are attacking the Ukrainian positions from the south, from the area of the village of Serebryanka, and the Russians are attacking from the north, from the settlement of Dibrova. The Russians are saying that they're about to encircle two brigades, the 53rd Separate Brigade and 119th Separate Brigade of the Armed Forces Territorial Defense. The Ukrainians are saying that these forces still haven't received order to retreat, and the Russians are saying that most likely they're waiting for 114th Brigade that is going to come here or have already arrived to unblock them. So very difficult situation. If the Russians are able to cut this silent, to cut this artillery pocket, then they will be able to maintain the line of combat contact and to continue outflanking of the city of Siversk from the north and from the northwest. Now let's move to the south in Kupyansk direction. During the previous 24 hours, we got additional changes on the ground. Different mappers reported that the Russians managed to improve their positions and to take under control around 30% of Terny, 30-40% of Terny. As for its city itself, the southern part and the main logistic hub, the main logistic area, was bombed by the Russians heavily with the total tower systems and with FABs. Most likely, tomorrow or the day after, the entire city, the entire village of Terny would be captured by the Russians. Now let's move further and let's talk about the north in Kupyansk direction. We have additional changes on the ground, as you can see. Today, the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that the group of forces west managed to establish complete control over the settlement by the name of Kruhliakivka. So the village was secured and cleared by the Russians, and as we know, the Russians entered the northern part of Zagryzovo. So we can compare the changes on map. This is the situation by the end of the 29th of October, and this is the situation by the end of the 30th of October. The Russians secured the village of Kruhliakivka in the north, in the west, and in the south, and currently there are very heavy clashes for the settlement of Zagryzovo. And based on these geolocations, based on all these things, we can make a conclusion that for some reason the Russians decided to not to intensify the Russian offensive operations in the direction of Kupyansk. First, the Russians decided to move in the southern direction with the purpose to take under control or to attack in the direction of Borovo. So most likely during the next several months, we're going to see Russian activity exactly in this area. Now let's move further and let's talk about the Sudzha direction. We have additional updates, and some sources reported that the Russians managed to enter and to take the village of Kruhliakivka. Later we got additional information from the sources on the ground, and the sources are saying that currently the Russians don't have strong control over the settlement of Kruhliakivka. The Russians do have possibilities to enter the territory of the settlement, but the Russians don't have possibilities to dig in deeper due to Ukrainian counterattacks. Also, we have additional reports that the Russians managed to restore control over the village by the name of Martinovka. This was published by the Russian sources, and currently we haven't received anything that can confirm this, but if we summarize everything, most likely the line of combat contact currently look like this. And the most important, that according to information we have, yet the Russians haven't introduced the Korean forces on the ground. Furthermore, we have additional Russian activity on the line between Kianitsa and Nikolaevo-Darin. As you can see, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians published a significant number of videos of how the Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian temporary deployment points, strongholds exactly in this area. If the Russians continue bombing and attacking the Ukrainians along this line, this might mean that most likely the Russians will try to encircle the Ukrainians in Sudzha by attacking the Ukrainian forces in the direction of the city by the name of Sumi. So this might be exactly what the Russians are planning to make, because the Russians need to do just one thing: to cut N07 road. If the Russians can cut this N07 road, then the Ukrainians that are currently located in the Sudzha direction would be encircled completely without any possibilities for evacuation. Now let's discuss several political events. We got a lot of things. The sources are saying that the situation is threatening. The number of deserters in the armed forces of Ukraine has increased significantly. We're talking about unauthorized abandonment of a military unit, desertion, and failure to follow orders, said Stanislav Kravchenko at a brief. Earlier it was reported that since the beginning of the war, more than 1,000 100,000 Ukrainian armed forces soldiers have gone on authorized abandonment of military unit. You know that some people are saying that there is a mass and there is different problems of Ukrainian army, but as for me, I see this 100,000 people as a way to earn money for Ukrainian militaries, because this is another schema how Ukrainian how your officers can earn money. You can say that your unit, your brigade, your battalion has 100 soldiers, but in real life there are just 20 soldiers. But you will receive salaries for 100 soldiers. Of course, you can collect them, but before any, let's say, check, before any audit, you can always say that 80 soldiers abandon their military positions and nobody will make you any damage or begin any criminal investigation. So I'm not sure that 100,000 people, soldiers, left Ukraine army. I believe that this is another schema of corruption of the Ukraine and Ukrainian armed forces. Furthermore, we got additional report that Ukrainians are planning to mobilize additionally 160,000 people, which is very interesting, which means that Ukrainians suffer significant problems. Either the Ukrainians are preparing themselves before the beginning another counterattack, but it's very difficult to understand where exactly the Ukrainians are planning to counterattack. Furthermore, today we got additional reports from the United States of America, and Zelensky himself. He reported that the things about the missiles Tomahawk was a secret part between the United States of America and Zelensky, and there were just two people in the world who knew this part. It was Zelensky himself and Joe Biden. But later this information was published in the media, and Zelensky said that currently he can't believe the United States of America because this confident information was revealed by the United States of America, and it's a very big mess, and it's very difficult to understand who Zelensky can believe and who he can trust in the future. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.